Hi, my name is Tom Christensen. Let me give you a little bit of my background. I'm a retired Army officer, and I taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point, at the Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and finally at the University of Wisconsin, all during my military career that lasted 24 and a half years. Today we're going to talk about the origins of World War I. Some of you know that World War I spanned from 1914 until 1918. It's also important to note that the U.S. doesn't become engaged in World War I until 1917. We're going to start off with a little story, and then I'm going to backtrack and explain a little bit why that was so important, because the origins of World War I occur in a very, very small town in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it's a story that I think is one of chance, but will be amazing in how this small action impacted the entire world from 1914 to 1918, with deaths that total over millions and millions. First of all, let's take a look at the map of Europe, and you'll see Sarajevo is located here. It was part of Austria-Hungary, and Austria wasn't a small country back then. It was a large country. It included Austria, Hungary, parts of what we call the Czech Republic, Slovenia, and many of the portions of Romania that were part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. There was another country here called Serbia. They were Pan-Slavs, and they wanted very, very badly to increase their territory, and they thought that if they could knock off and kill the heir to the throne of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, that they could gain some land and their more independence for the Slavs living in that area. And so in July 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were going to take a trip to, and I'll show you a picture of them right here. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were going to take a trip to Sarajevo and just basically wave the flag and demonstrate that, in fact, Austria-Hungary supports that province as part of their kingdom. And in the same light, a secret organization from Serbia called the Black Hand, was hired by the Serbian intelligence agency. And I want to put this in some perspective, because what happens in this assassination plot is that it would be the same thing as if our CIA, without telling the president or without telling Congress, decides to murder Putin in Russia or the leader of China. It would be the same thing. That's kind of what happens. They hire a terrorist organization and basically send them to Sarajevo to kill Archduke Ferdinand while he's visiting there in July of 1914. So let me set the stage for it. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are traveling in an open car. You can see it's an older car, obviously, from 1914, but it's a convertible. It has a large awning that goes back, and so it was set there. And they decide to ride down the streets of Sarajevo. The authorities had put people there to wave to them and welcome them to Sarajevo. And during that first trip in the morning, the assassins were lined up along the route. They knew where he was going to come. And they go by the first assassin, a man called Gavrilo Princip. This is his name there. And Princip decides that, as much as he wants to kill Franz Ferdinand, he kind of decides maybe it's a little bit too dangerous, and he chickens out. They move farther down the road, and a number of the other assassins were along the road. Some, again, chickened out, just as Gavrilo Princip did, but one didn't. And he threw a grenade at the car, hits the back of the car in this area, bounces off, it doesn't go into the car, bounces off to the street below, and it blows up. It doesn't hurt Franz Ferdinand or his wife Sophie or any members of the official party, but about 15 to 20 people are in fact wounded by the shrapnel. The motorcade continues on, and in fact Franz Ferdinand even goes to the City Hall in Sarajevo and delivers a speech. He's obviously not very happy with the welcome because somebody had tried to assassinate him, but it's amazing that he in fact delivered a speech there. And then they're getting ready to, and they have lunch also there in the city hall. And after lunch, they decide to get back in their vehicle and off they're going to go and continue their trip in Sarajevo. Now, Franz Ferdinand had discussed what he wanted to do with most of the motorcade, and basically what he wanted to do was go visit the people in the hospital that had been wounded that morning, as kind of a show, as many political leaders would probably have done. And he tells everybody about this except the most important guy, his own driver. His own driver thinks that the route is the same route that had been planned before, and so off he goes down the street. And in fact, remember, here's Gavrilo Princip. He's already thinking to himself, boy, I chickened out, I failed, etc., etc. And he's on a very side street. And here comes Franz Ferdinand. And it's about that time of the day that Franz Ferdinand realizes that, wait a second, we're not heading toward the hospital. Where are we going? We're going in the wrong direction. And in fact, he signals to the driver to turn around, that he wants to go to the hospital. Well, there's nowhere to turn around on the street, except there's a side street that goes down to the left, and he takes this car to the left to make a U-turn and turn around and come back the other way. And wouldn't you know, by chance, there's Gavrilo Princip right in that side street, totally by chance. At this time, he had already been discussing with himself the fact that he had chickened out, and all of a sudden, here's his target presenting himself, doing a U-turn, stopping in front of him. He jumps up on the running board of the vehicle and fires shots that hit both Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein and Sophie in the stomach. Both will die within hours. Okay, Franz Ferdinand bleeds to death very, very quickly. Sophie, his wife, doesn't die for several hours. So why is that important? By the way, Gavrilo Princip is caught, as is the other assassin who had thrown the grenade in the morning. The other assassin, interestingly, thought he would jump into the river and escape swimming across the river. It turned out the river was only about 1.5 feet deep, and so he didn't get very far. At any rate, Gavrilo Princip and the other assassin were both grabbed by authorities. In fact, his capture is actually on film. They actually, because they were filming the Archduke there in Sarajevo, there were cameramen around, just as there would be in the modern political world today, and they actually saw Gavrilo Princip being captured and led away. So why is this important, and why did this affect World War I? Remember, most of us from childhood thought this war was Germany against France, England, and later the United States. That's what we always think about it. But wait a second, we're talking about Serbia and Austria here. So what happened? Why did everybody get involved in the war? So now I'm going to explain that. Basically, Serbia is part of a PanSlavic movement, Slavic nationalism, okay, that was led by Russia here. And the Russians were allied with the French. And they had an entente or understanding with England. And what that meant was that if anybody was attacked by another power, they would come in and protect the other ones into the alliance. Likewise, the Germans had what was called the Triple Alliance. They had Germany, they had Austria, and believe it or not, they even had Italy here. However, the Italians said, we will only come into the war if you are attacked first. So I want you to know that, because that's the setting that we have when a whole series of events over a very few days occur that lead to the First World War. And now you're going to see how, just like if you ever played dominoes and lined up dominoes and stood them up, how you hit one domino and they tip the whole chain down, one after the other. That's kind of what happens in 1914, in the summer of 1914, July and August, during that time period. I must say that none of the countries expected to go to war. None of the countries expected to go to war during that time. There had been many minor incidents, but they'd all been resolved either by people backing off or some type of peace agreement during that time. There had been incidents, There was tension. However, nothing had ever come to war. And if it were a betting man in July, even after this incident occurred, you would have assumed that, in fact, nothing would happen this time. There would be tension and there would be bad feeling, but nobody would go to war, or it would be just a very limited war, maybe Austria against Serbia. That didn't happen, and I'll explain why. And the reason why was this, what we call entangling alliances. Alliances between France, Russia, and between Germany and Austria, and what they would do in case, okay? And so when this happens in Sarajevo, of course the Austrians are very upset that their soon-to-be ruler was killed, assassinated, because he was the next in line for the throne. And so they decide to send a whole list, an ultimatum list, to the Serbians, say, you have to do this, 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 this. There were many different points to that ultimatum, and there were so many points that the Austrians made it almost impossible for the Serbians to meet their demands. They would have had to actually give up their autonomy, their own self-control to the Austrians. The Austrians made it so difficult. During this time also, this time of tension, to show support to the Serbians when they got that ultimatum, Russia starts to mobilize their forces. And this whole idea of mobilization, well, what does mobilization mean? It means calling up your reserves. You have a regular army, which is relatively small, and then you have a reserve force, which is enormous, millions and millions of men. And so what happens is, when Serbia gets these demands, Russia starts to mobilize. Well, when Russia starts to mobilize, Germany starts to mobilize, France starts to mobilize, and all these countries are now getting set to mobilize. Not only actively, but getting ready to execute their war plans in case somebody did something to somebody else. And so there's a lot of tension out there. I'm making this very simplified, by the way. It's a very complicated system. Germany, by the way, their foreign minister, the Kaiser was on a vacation during this time. Germany, by the way, decides to tell Austria, do whatever you want, we'll support you. This was called the blank check. The blank check, basically, as you would imagine, do whatever you want, you can put any number in the check and we'll pay it off. Well, Germany gave them a blank check. And so the Austrians felt even more strong. Well, if Germany's going to do this, then we'll be able to do anything we want with Serbia, and nobody will ever do anything, because if Germany supports us, Russia certainly won't do anything, France won't do anything. Well, it had just the opposite effect. Let's take a look at the three rulers of the countries involved. This is Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. This is George V of England. And this is Nicholas II of Russia. France has a democratic leader, okay? But these three leaders, kings, Russia, Germany, and finally England, are interestingly enough all cousins. Look at the similarities between Nicholas of Russia, for example, and George V of England. They look almost identical. Wilhelm looks a little bit different. But they're all first cousins. And in fact, to stop this mobilization, because their war plans were based upon how fast they could mobilize to be able to attack, because the German war plan at the time was to quickly conquer France and then shift their forces, because they knew it was going to take longer for Russia, because it was slower, less developed country, and then shift their forces from France after they took over France and shift them over to the Eastern Front. That was the plan. And so mobilization and being able to mobilize fast and get on with the war was imperative if they were going to win the war. And that also was part of that domino effect, where you hit one and everybody keeps going down the line. The only country that kind of stayed out of it initially was Italy. They don't enter the war until 1915. And they don't enter the war because, even though they were part of this triple alliance, they said, wait a second, Austria attacked Serbia. It wasn't the other way around. And so we're not held or bound by that treaty. Okay? So again, to make it very, very simple. And so you have these, what we call entangling alliances, where even if we don't want to do something, we have to do something, basically, according to the alliance. Great Britain, it has an entente. They're not going to go to war, even though France and Russia are mobilizing, and it looks like they're going to go to war against Germany. Great Britain says, we won't go to war either. They're kind of like Italy, except we guarantee the neutrality of Belgium. Okay? Here's little Belgium up here. And they said, we won't do anything as long as the Germans attack France and they leave Belgium alone. Well, unfortunately for the Germans, that wasn't part of their war plan. Their war plan said, we're going to sweep through Belgium. And so when the war first breaks out, okay, when negotiations don't work between these powers, the Germans do attack through Belgium. And of course, that brings Great Britain or England into the war. So the war is set up with England, France, and Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Another one of the allies of the Germans and Austrians was Turkey. And they have an interest also because they want to reestablish their influence in the Balkans also. So you can see how the world is set up at that time. And so mobilization is probably the key term that you need to understand. Getting their forces ready to go, where they go from hundreds of thousands of people in their armies to millions in their army. And I say millions because let me just briefly talk about the war 1914 to 1918 and what the eventual cost of that war is going to be. The cost is enormous. 2 million men Germany lost in killed. Great Britain, 750,000. France, 600,000. Italy, 460,000. Austria, 1 million. Russia, 1.8 to 2 million people died. The United States doesn't come into the war until 1917, and they lose 117,000 during that time period. And so this is the beginning of World War I. It's a very, very complicated beginning, I understand that, but it's important to understand again, though, because after the World War is over, and this is we'll deal with this situation in a future lecture, the Allies, meaning England, France, and the U.S. and Italy, make the Germans sign a decree saying they started the war. They were responsible for the war. And I want to ask you the question is, do you think that the Germans were really responsible for the war, or do you think they were just stupid that they came in and supported Austria? Because the war really started because of Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. That's the final thought I want to leave you with. The First World War started over this issue between Serbia and Austria-Hungary and Gavrilo Princip killing the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. If you have questions about any of this, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. You can put those on Facebook, I guess. What is this? I have to ask my director, producer, my wife.
YouTube.
Yeah, you can put
down below.
You can put these questions on YouTube down below, and I'd be more than happy to answer those questions. It's very, very complicated. I've made it very simplistic. I hope that you understand. Again, you'll probably need a map of Europe. And again, in future lectures, there won't be so many map drills, and it won't be so complex. The next lecture I'm going to talk about is the modernization of World War I and some of the weapons that were involved in World War I, which are not like anything that had ever been used in the world before. So I think you'll find that interesting. And then we'll move through World War I, the interwar years, the development of fascism, meaning in Italy, and Nazism in Germany, and then all the way through World War II. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you.